I'm Rachel Whitman, 34, and until earlier this year, my world revolved around the genetics wing at Northfield University Medical Research Center in Minneapolis. I spent over a decade studying rare hereditary brain disorders, work inspired entirely by my grandfather, who recently passed and left me his estate. That's when everything began to unravel. My mother insisted I hand it all over to my younger brother. When I refused, she snapped. In a blind rage, she destroyed nearly a decade of my research. What none of us saw coming was how one set of DNA results would shake the very roots of our family tree. If you're wondering what kind of mother would sabotage her own daughter's life's work, buckle up, because this story twists harder than a double helix. Before I go further, drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever faced betrayal from your own family, hit that like and subscribe. Growing up, my grandfather, Henry Whitman, was my guiding light. While my classmates hung pop stars on their bedroom walls, I had a blown-up photo of Barbara McClintock taped above my desk. Grandpa Henry caught on early to my obsession with science. I was 8 when he first showed me how to extract DNA from strawberries in his kitchen, calling it kitchen counter science. "Rachel," he'd say with a soft laugh, "our entire history is written in code, if you know how to read it." Those afternoons in his garage-turned-lab sparked a lifelong fire in me. While my parents scoffed, Grandpa encouraged me to keep going. My mother, Janice, only cared about appearances and charity luncheons. My father, Gerald, well-meaning but passive, followed her lead. And then there was my brother, Logan, charming, entitled, and always center stage. "She's just being dramatic," my mother used to say to her friends when I declined family brunches to work on lab reports. "Rachel will snap out of this scientist phase." But I never did. Thanks to Grandpa Henry's belief in me, I earned my PhD from Johns Hopkins in 2011 and went on to specialize in a rare condition we now call Whitman-Keller syndrome, partially named for Grandpa, who first linked it to a recessive gene in the mid-1980s. He never stopped supporting me until the very end. And what I discovered next, in his personal genetic archive? It would change our family forever. This rare neurological disorder, Whitman-Keller syndrome, affects fewer than 1,000 people globally. It causes steady motor decline beginning in early childhood. For over a decade, I had devoted myself to studying it. In that time, I built a database of patient DNA, ran thousands of tests, and developed early detection protocols that were finally showing encouraging results. The university held a gala to celebrate the progress. Dr. Whitman is leading the future of personalized genetic medicine, my department head proclaimed to a ballroom full of donors. My grandfather, then 89, sat beaming in the front row, clutching my hand as I stepped off stage. My parents were there too, though their expression suggested they'd rather be anywhere else. "Couldn't you focus on something more commercial?" my mother, Janice, once asked me bluntly. "Your brother's real estate business could use someone with your project management skills." My brother Logan's business consisted of 2 dilapidated duplexes in St. Paul and an ever-rotating list of startup dreams, a failed sports bar, a handmade shoe line, an online marketplace for luxury pet beds. None of them lasted long. But no matter the outcome, my mother defended him. "Logan just hasn't found the right fit yet. Not everyone finds their passion at 8 years old like you, Rachel." What I didn't know at the time was how far into debt Logan had sunk. His gambling, online sports betting mostly, was spiraling out of control. And he'd borrowed money from people who weren't exactly the type you call when you're late on payments. Everything shifted 6 months ago when Grandpa Henry died peacefully in his sleep, just shy of his 90th birthday. The loss felt like a hole had been punched through my chest. He'd been my mentor, my anchor. That night, I stayed late in the lab, staring at the genetic sequence I'd been analyzing, unable to focus, hollow in a way no scientific logic could mend. His funeral was held in a quiet, white-steepled church in Duluth, where he'd worshipped since the 1960s. Former colleagues from his university years stood shoulder to shoulder with family. I gave the eulogy, struggling only once, when I spoke of how he funded my first clinical trial when no one else would. My mother dabbed at dry eyes with her lace-trimmed handkerchief. Logan looked somber, but distant. My father, silent as ever, squeezed my shoulder as I sat down. "He was always proud of you," he whispered. It was one of the rare times he contradicted my mother. 3 days later, we were called to the downtown law office of Calvin Brooks, Grandpa's longtime attorney. The walls were lined with books and photos of Harvard reunions. Calvin, silver-haired and warm-voiced, welcomed us in. What he was about to reveal would start an avalanche we couldn't stop. "Henry was very specific about his wishes," Calvin Brooks began, adjusting his glasses as he opened a thick folder atop his polished walnut desk. "I'll try to make this as clear as possible." The terms of the will were direct and concise. I, Rachel Whitman, was named the primary beneficiary of my grandfather's estate, valued at roughly $3.2 million. That included his historic craftsman-style home overlooking Lake Superior, his carefully managed investment portfolio, and an irreplaceable archive of scientific journals, notebooks, and preserved DNA samples. There were modest bequests, donations to 2 medical research institutes, a generous sum for his longtime housekeeper, and $25,000 to my brother Logan. The sharp, indignant breath my mother drew was impossible to miss. "There must be some mistake," she said coolly, her fingers tightening around the handle of her Michael Kors handbag. "Henry always wanted the estate divided equally." Calvin's expression remained composed but resolute. "I'm afraid not, Janice. Henry was very clear in both writing and in person. He wanted his scientific legacy to continue through Rachel's work." "This is absurd," my mother hissed, her voice rising. "Logan is just as much his grandson. He has needs, too." I sat frozen. While I had always known Grandpa Henry supported my work, I never imagined he'd leave me everything. The weight of that decision hit me hard. It was meaningful, yes, but profoundly sad. I would have traded every cent just to sit beside him one more time in his garage lab. "Mom, it's okay," I said softly. "I'll help Logan. We can talk about something fair." But Logan didn't look at me. He hadn't spoken since we entered the office, his posture stiff, his jaw tight. "We'll discuss this at home," my mother snapped, rising from her chair. "Calvin, we'll be contesting the will." "That is your legal right," Calvin replied, though his eyes held a quiet warning. But Henry was thorough. "The will is very difficult to dispute." The drive back to my parents' house was filled with silence so thick it seemed to press against the windows. Once inside, my mother's mask shattered. "Your grandfather wasn't thinking straight near the end," she said as she paced. "Logan's future depends on this inheritance. He's in serious trouble." "I get it, Mom," I said calmly. "I'll support him. But Grandpa's legacy matters too. His home, his work, it's irreplaceable." Logan finally looked up, eyes dark with worry. "I didn't ask for this, Rach," he muttered. "But I'm in real trouble." It went deeper than I realized. Over the next hour, the full truth came out. Logan had borrowed money from people who didn't offer friendly payment plans or second chances. His gambling addiction had snowballed far beyond online sports bets. He owed nearly $800,000 to private creditors, some of whom had begun making threats. "I can help," I offered quietly. "We can use part of the inheritance to set up a repayment plan. I can even liquidate some of Grandpa's investments." "That won't be enough," my mother Janice snapped. "We need to sell everything. The house, the lab materials, all of it." "But that's not what Grandpa wanted," I protested. "His research archives belong in a lab or university, not on an auction block. And the house is worth over $1 million in this market," she interrupted sharply. "Henry is gone, Rachel. What matters now is the living." That night marked the beginning of what I silently called the family Cold War. The following week, Janice invited me to what she called a healing dinner. It turned out to be an ambush. Aunts, uncles, and cousins I hadn't spoken to in years were all seated around the table, eyeing me like I was the villain of some family drama. "Family needs to stick together," Aunt Colleen said as she passed the dessert. "Your grandfather wouldn't want us at each other's throats over this." "Your research is admirable," Uncle Dale chimed in, "but Logan's in real danger." I nodded silently, excused myself early, and left with a stomach full of food and a heart full of betrayal. Only my father, Gerald, remained silent throughout. His eyes spoke of discomfort, but, as always, he said nothing. In the weeks that followed, I buried myself in my lab work. Science, with all its rules and logic, gave me comfort when everything else felt like chaos. The inheritance remained untouched, as Janice now threatened to sue for control of the estate. "Your grandfather knew this might happen," Calvin told me during a quiet meeting at his office. "Your mother has always been persistent." What I didn't yet know was how far that persistence would go. 3 weeks after the will reading, the pressure campaign escalated. Janice began calling every day, sometimes weeping, sometimes cold and furious. "I carried you for 9 months!" she cried during one call. "I drove you to every camp, every science fair, and this is how you repay me? By letting your brother suffer? Mom, I've offered to help," I said for what felt like the 100th time. "But Grandpa's scientific legacy matters. It's irreplaceable. His house contains his life's work." "Things," my mother spat. "You're choosing things over your brother's safety?" The calls started coming at all hours. Sometimes I'd wake up at 3 a.m., my phone buzzing with long, guilt-laced texts listing every sacrifice my parents had made to support my education. Soon, cousins and even distant relatives joined in, a chorus of blame, pressuring me to give Logan the entire inheritance. Logan's approach was quieter, more pitiful. He started dropping by my apartment unannounced, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. "They've threatened to break my legs, Rach," he whispered during one visit, handing me his phone. I scrolled through a string of menacing messages from unknown numbers. My stomach turned. "I'm not making this up." "We need to go to the police," I said. "These aren't people who fear the police," he replied. "They don't send warnings twice." Desperate to help him safely, I contacted Calvin Brooks again. "We could establish a trust," he suggested, "with strict conditions, rehab, counseling, and financial oversight. That way, you're honoring Henry's wishes and helping Logan." It seemed like a reasonable compromise. But when I proposed it to my mother, her response was icy. "Your brother doesn't need to be treated like a child," she snapped. "He needs a second chance, a clean slate. That means all of the estate." "Mom, I've tried to meet you halfway." "No halfway," she said sharply. "Sign everything over. That's the only acceptable solution." Then came the moment that truly shook me. It was 5 weeks after Grandpa's funeral. I was working late in the genetics wing when I got a security alert. Someone had entered the lab using my access code. I pulled up the surveillance feed. My mother, storming down the corridor. I rushed out to intercept her. "Mom? What are you doing here? It's nearly midnight." She brushed past me without a word, scanning the lab like it personally offended her. "This is what you've chosen? Beakers and notebooks over your family?" "This is important," I said, trying to stay calm. She picked up one of my notebooks, the one with 6 months of clinical trial data. "Mom, be careful." "Important," she snapped. "Logan got a visit today. They threatened to break his fingers by month's end." "I'm doing what I can," I said. "Offers aren't enough," she growled, slamming the notebook onto the table near a delicate rack of samples. "Sign the estate to your brother, all of it, or you're no longer my daughter." The silence between us was colder than the lab air. "You don't mean that," I whispered. But deep down, I knew she did. "Try me." Her voice was ice. Her eyes, once familiar, now looked at me like I was a stranger. "Family loyalty comes before everything, Rachel. More than your grandfather's wishes. More than this." She waved her hand dismissively at my lab bench, as if my life's work were nothing more than clutter. After she left, I sat at my desk, hands trembling. That visit had gone beyond pressure. It felt like a veiled threat. I didn't feel safe. The next morning, I had a locksmith rekey my office, changed every access code, and installed 2 new motion-triggered cameras. My lab, once my sanctuary, now felt like a battleground. Later that week, I met again with Calvin Brooks. His office, with its warm wood paneling and quiet air of order, felt like the last neutral ground I had. "Your mother has officially filed a challenge to the will," Calvin said, face grim. But there's something else you should be aware of. He paused, his fingers steepled thoughtfully, as though weighing what he was about to say. Your grandfather came to see me about 8 months ago, he finally said. He expressed concerns, personal ones, about family dynamics. As a result, he added a contingency to the will. It only takes effect if the will is contested. What kind of contingency? I asked, my pulse picking up. DNA verification. Calvin said it gently, but firmly. Henry had private concerns about certain relationships. He didn't elaborate, but he was insistent. If the will is challenged, any heirs must undergo DNA testing before any assets can be released. I leaned back in the chair, stunned. DNA tests? What was he worried about? He didn't say, Calvin replied. But your grandfather was sharp. This wasn't confusion or paranoia. He knew what he was doing. So, what now? Now that the will has been formally contested, the provision is triggered. All named beneficiaries must provide DNA samples. When I told my mother about the requirement, her reaction was explosive. Absolutely not. This is ridiculous. Your grandfather was clearly losing his grip near the end. It's just a cheek swab, I said. But if you want to contest the will, it's mandatory. After hours of shouting and accusations, both Janice and Logan finally, reluctantly agreed. My father, though not a named heir, quietly volunteered. For the sake of transparency, he said. None of us could have predicted what those small samples would uncover, or just how far my mother would go to bury the truth before it came out. The morning everything changed started like any other. I arrived at my lab at 7:30 a.m., coffee thermos in hand, my mind already sorting through a dozen tasks. The genetics wing at Northfield University had been my second home for over a decade. The East Corridor, where my lab was located, bore my fingerprints in every detail. Equipment placement, labeling systems, even the calming gray-blue wall color I had picked years ago. Centrifuges, PCR analyzers, and high-resolution microscopes lined my central workbench. The walls held coolers and shelves stacked with samples, some from children diagnosed with Whitman-Keller syndrome, others from baseline studies. My desk in the far corner overflowed with data logs, notebooks, and genetic printouts. That day, I was particularly energized. I'd uncovered a promising correlation between a recessive genetic marker and the early onset of the condition. If verified, it could allow for diagnoses years earlier, maybe even pre-symptomatically. Morning, Dr. Whitman, called Angela, my grad assistant, breezing in at 8:15. Those new samples from Seattle Children's just arrived. I've already logged them. Perfect timing, I said, already slipping on gloves. Let's begin the first run this morning. We worked in rhythm for hours. By noon, Angela left for her bioethics seminar, and I decided to grab a sandwich from the cafe across the street. Before leaving, I followed my routine. Samples secured, fridge locked, computers encrypted, door sealed. As I stood waiting in line, my phone buzzed with a security alert. Someone had used my old access code, the one I'd changed after my mother's last outburst. I opened the attached camera feed. Janice. There she was, entering the corridor outside my lab, lips tight, eyes set. I dropped my order and ran. By the time I reached the hallway, I could already hear it. Glass shattering, metal crashing. I shoved open the door to see her in the center of the wreckage, clutching one of my research notebooks. Mom, what are you doing? I screamed, sprinting toward her. She fed pages into the shredder with vicious precision. Refrigerators stood ajar, samples dumped and ruined. My monitor lay face down, screen fractured. This is what you chose over your family? She shrieked. Over your brother? Stop! That data is irreplaceable. I lunged, trying to snatch the book from her hands. Logan deserves it more than you ever will, she spat, tearing page after page. He's suffering because of your selfishness. This isn't about inheritance, I cried. But her fury said otherwise. I stood frozen as she swept her arm across a full shelf of prepared slides, sending them crashing to the tile floor like broken glass rain. This is my life's work, I choked out, voice cracking. You always were selfish. Janice said coldly, her rage now eerily measured. So special, so smart. Grandpa's favorite, never once thinking about anyone else. My feet refused to move. I watched in stunned silence as she tore through 10 years of research, sample containers labeled with coded patient IDs, many from families who had trusted me with their children's DNA, hoping for answers. Now, ruined. What shocked me most in the aftermath wasn't her destruction. It was my own calm. After the initial horror, a strange detachment settled over me. I stopped trying to stop her. I simply stood, observing as if from outside myself, while she reduced my career to shards and dust. Oddly, my stillness seemed to enrage her even more. "Say something," she demanded, panting, eyes wild. "Don't just stand there with that smug face." "What would you like me to say, Mom?" I asked quietly. "That you've won? That I'll hand over Grandpa's estate now that you've destroyed everything I've built?" "Yes," she screamed. "Logan needs that money. His life depends on it." I drew a breath and said evenly, "Most of my data is backed up on university servers. There are archives in 2 secure locations. The samples are a painful loss, yes, but not everything is gone." I looked her in the eye. "What you've really destroyed today is any remaining relationship between us." My words seemed to slow her. She paused, looking around at the wreckage, as if seeing it clearly for the first time. A flicker of doubt crept across her face. "You never understood family loyalty," she whispered. "Neither did your grandfather. Always hiding in labs instead of taking care of what really matters." "Please leave," I said quietly. "Campus security is on the way. I called them when I got the alert." Right on cue, 2 officers appeared in the doorway, their eyes widening at the scene. "Dr. Whitman? Is everything okay?" one asked. "No," I replied. "Please escort my mother out and call the police. I'll be pressing charges for destruction of research property." Janice's mouth fell open. "You'd have your own mother arrested?" "You've left me no choice," I said, my voice trembling now. "Please go." As they led her away, I remained still, surrounded by shattered glass, silence, and the pieces of everything I had once believed was safe. The specialized freezer in the corner, where I stored my rarest Whitman-Keller syndrome samples, had been unplugged. Its contents were already thawing, genetic material degrading beyond use. Notebooks filled with handwritten insights, some dating back to my postdoc days, were shredded beyond recognition. Equipment worth hundreds of thousands lay damaged or smashed. Only when I was completely alone did the numbness fade. I collapsed to the floor amidst the ruin, broken glass, mangled journals, and the ghost of 10 years of work. The sobs came without warning, loud, primal, wrenching. I stayed there, crumpled on the cold tile, until I heard the lab door creak open. "Oh my God," Angela whispered, weaving carefully through the debris. "Dr. Whitman? Rachel? What happened?" I looked up, my face streaked with tears. Family happened. The next few hours were a haze of flashing cameras, police reports, and questions. First campus police, then city officers. My department chair arrived, ashen and silent as he took in the destruction. Colleagues peeked in from nearby labs, their faces twisted in shock. The damage was personal, deliberate. "We'll rebuild," my department head said, resting a hand on my shoulder. "Your backups, your papers, they're intact. Materials can be replaced." But we both knew better. Some of the patient samples had come from children who were now gone. Others were irreplaceable genetic baselines from early onset cases. And my journals, the scrawled connections I hadn't yet digitized, were lost forever. That night, after the police were done, and the university assigned a security detail to my lab, I walked home in silence. And for the first time in my life, I filed for a restraining order against my own mother. As I filled out the paperwork in my apartment, my phone lit up with messages. Gerald, my father, expressing dazed confusion. Logan, torn between apologizing and pleading for the inheritance again. Friends offered lab space and support. I ignored them all, focusing on the forms in front of me. Something deeper than lab samples had been destroyed. My understanding of family had shifted, violently and irreversibly. My mother hadn't just lashed out. She tried to erase me. And yet, something didn't add up. The desperation she'd shown, the lengths she went to, it wasn't just about Logan's debts. There was something she hadn't told us. 2 weeks later, we reconvened at Calvin Brooks's office. The polished mahogany table, the sterile lighting, none of it could contain the truth about to erupt in that cold corporate room. Northfield University had been more supportive than I expected. My department chair helped me file insurance claims, and colleagues from neighboring labs offered space, supplies, and their time to help recover what fragments of my work remained. The police had formally charged Janice with destruction of property and unlawful entry. Whether it would go to trial remained uncertain, but the restraining order stood. She was barred from coming within 500 feet of my lab or my home. I arrived at Calvin Brooks's office early that morning, needing time to collect myself before what promised to be a brutal meeting. Calvin greeted me with quiet concern, the kind of weariness only someone who had seen too many families collapse under the weight of legacies and secrets could carry. "How are you holding up, Rachel?" he asked, offering me a cup of coffee. "As well as can be expected," I replied, wrapping my hands around the warmth of the mug. "Has everyone confirmed they're coming?" "Yes. Your mother's attorney told her attendance is mandatory if she wishes to continue contesting the will." He tapped a sealed envelope resting on the polished conference table. "The DNA results have arrived. I haven't opened them. That should happen with all parties present." I nodded, heart racing. What had Grandpa Henry suspected? Why had he demanded genetic verification as a condition of inheritance? My father, Gerald, arrived next. He looked 10 years older than he had a month ago. His usual composure traded for hunched shoulders and weary eyes. "Rach," he said, voice rough. He hugged me, something he hadn't done in years. "I'm so sorry. What your mother did? It was unforgivable." "You've spoken to her?" I asked, surprised by his sudden willingness to confront her actions. "We're taking some time apart," he said carefully. "This has made me reevaluate things." Before I could respond, the door opened again. Logan walked in, surprisingly put together, hair combed, suit jacket freshly pressed. He gave me a hesitant nod but kept his distance. Then came Janice, flanked by her attorney, an impeccably dressed woman with razor-sharp eyes and a clipboard full of strategy. Janice sat across from me, poised and unreadable, as though the restraining order and charges were nothing more than an inconvenience. Once we were all seated, Calvin cleared his throat. "Now that everyone's present," he began, "we'll begin with a formal challenge to Henry Whitman's will, filed by Janice Whitman. After that, per the will's stipulation, we'll review the DNA results. Finally," Calvin said, "we'll discuss next steps based on the DNA findings." Janice's attorney leaned forward, tone clipped and polished. "My client maintains that her father-in-law, Henry Whitman, was not of sound mind when drafting his most recent will. The disproportionate distribution to a single grandchild, particularly one in the sciences, suggests undue influence." "That's a serious accusation," Calvin replied calmly. However, Henry underwent a full cognitive and psychological evaluation just 2 weeks before signing this document. He slid a folder across the table. "The results show he was entirely competent. He made these decisions with full clarity." He let the words hang before adding, "Henry also recorded a video message explaining his reasoning. I'm prepared to play it, if necessary." That made Janice shift in her seat. She hadn't expected that. "But before we move forward," Calvin continued, "the will stipulates that in the event of a contest, DNA verification is required before any assets can be distributed." He picked up the sealed envelope on the table. "These results come from Gene Trust Labs, an independent facility. They tested DNA samples from Rachel, Logan, Gerald, and Janice Whitman, compared to Henry's profile, which was archived in his medical file." The room went silent. Calvin opened the envelope and studied the documents inside. His eyes briefly widened, his composure cracked just enough to send a chill through the room. "Well," he said finally, looking up, "this is unexpected." "What is it?" my father asked. leaning forward, already pale. Calvin took a steadying breath. According to these results, Logan Whitman is not biologically related to Henry Whitman. The room froze. That's impossible, Janice snapped. Those tests are wrong. Logan stared at her, stunned. What does that mean? Grandpa wasn't my grandfather? Calvin raised a hand. There's more. The test also indicates that Logan is not genetically related to Gerald Whitman either. A silence heavier than any before settled over us. My father's face turned ashen. Janice, he said softly, what is this? Her face twitched. They're wrong, she said. But her voice wavered, her certainty collapsing. Gene Trust is the most reliable lab in the country, I said quietly. Their margin of error is nearly non-existent. You knew, my father whispered, voice hollow. All these years. You knew. Janice's attorney leaned in, murmuring rapidly into her ear. But it was too late. She wasn't listening anymore. If you've ever uncovered a family secret that changed everything, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, because the truth that comes out in the next chapter will leave everyone reeling. It was one mistake, Janice finally said, her voice cracking as tears spilled freely. One night. Gerald, you were away at that literature conference in Boston. Roger. He was just there when I needed someone. Roger? My father looked disoriented, as if the room had tilted beneath him. Roger Wilson, she whispered, from the English department. My father blinked, stunned. 35 years ago, he murmured, mentally calculating the timeline, his academic instincts still intact amid the emotional wreckage. You've lied to me for 35 years? To all of us? Logan sat utterly still, his expression shattered. I'm not a Whitman, he finally choked out. You are my son, Janice said desperately, reaching toward him. That doesn't change. He flinched away. Everything changes. Who even am I now? As the silence settled, it clicked in my mind, sickening and sharp. This is why you were so determined to have Logan inherit everything, I said slowly, my voice trembling. You knew that if DNA testing happened, the truth would come out. Calvin interjected gently. Henry never had definitive proof, but he told me he had doubts. That's why he insisted on the DNA clause if the will was ever challenged. Suspected what? Logan demanded, his voice tight with emotion. That I wasn't part of the family? That I was some mistake? No, I said, reaching across the table. You're still my brother. That doesn't change. Not for me. But the weight of it all, the inheritance, the manipulation, the lab destruction, it all made sense now. My mother hadn't just wanted to protect Logan. She'd wanted to protect herself, to shield her secret no matter the cost. I think we should adjourn for today, Calvin said softly. This is a lot to process. My father stood abruptly. I'll be staying at the faculty club, he announced. Janice, have your things out of the house by the weekend. Gerald, please, she began, but he held up his hand. 35 years, Janice. Every single day. A lie. He turned to Logan. I raised you. I loved you. That hasn't changed. But I need time. Without another word, he walked out. Logan followed moments later, ignoring our mother's frantic voice trailing behind him. The confident woman who had ruled every family decision for decades now sat crumpled in her chair. Janice's shoulders slumped, her mascara streaked down her cheeks, her usual control dissolved into something raw and unfamiliar. For the first time, she looked her full age, and maybe more. Calvin and I exchanged a brief glance. The will contest had, in effect, collapsed under its own truth. With Logan proven to be unrelated to Henry Whitman, his legal claim to the inheritance disappeared entirely. But there was no sense of triumph in the room, just silence and the echoes of everything we'd lost. What happens now? I asked, watching as my mother was gently led out by her attorney, who looked more like a babysitter than legal counsel. Legally, the will stands, Calvin said as he gathered the papers. You inherit everything, as your grandfather intended. He paused. As for your family, that's beyond my professional expertise, Rachel. I left the office with my grandfather's legacy in my name, but the remnants of my family scattered behind me like broken glass. The rational side of me understood what the DNA results had revealed. The scientist in me recognized the evidence. But the human part, the daughter, the sister, I was only beginning to absorb the emotional weight of it all. In the days that followed, everything moved in a haze. The inheritance was secure, but the emotional cost felt devastating. Our family, flawed as it was, had splintered along the seams of a secret kept for decades. My father, always the quiet professor, more comfortable quoting Yeats than expressing his feelings, had moved into faculty housing. In our one phone call, his voice sounded cracked, like glass under pressure. "I've lived a life built on fiction, Rach," he said. "Ironic for a literature professor, isn't it?" "Dad, I'm so sorry," I whispered, knowing it wasn't enough. "Your mother and I meet with divorce attorneys next week," he added quietly. 38 years of marriage, undone by a DNA test. Not exactly how I pictured retirement. Logan's reaction was different, just as heartbreaking. He vanished after the meeting. 3 days later, at 2 a.m., he showed up at my apartment, unshaven, exhausted. "Can I crash here?" he asked softly. "I've just been driving, thinking." "Of course," I said, pulling him inside. He collapsed on the couch. "I'm not hungry, just lost." As I made him coffee, he stared blankly at the wall. "My whole life feels like a lie, Rach," he whispered. "Even the medical forms I filled out last year, wrong." "You're still you," I said gently, sitting beside him. "None of that changes what you mean to me. Your experiences, your memories, those are real," I said gently. Logan looked up at me, the usual spark of bravado in his eyes replaced by raw vulnerability. "But who am I?" he asked. "If I'm not Gerald Whitman's son, not Henry's grandson, then who?" "You're Logan," I said simply. "My brother. That hasn't changed." His eyes were red, tired. "I'm furious with her, Rachel. Not even about the affair. That's between her and Dad. But the lie? Letting me believe I was someone I'm not. My whole life." "I understand," I said quietly. Though really, could anyone fully comprehend the weight of a fractured identity? He raked a hand through his unwashed hair and let out a dry laugh. "The weirdest thing? I'm almost relieved about the gambling debt now. At least that disaster was mine. 100% my mess." We talked until dawn. Our conversation wandered, from abstract debates about nature versus nurture to concrete questions like whether he should try contacting Roger Wilson, the man now revealed to be his biological father. Roger had moved to Santa Barbara years ago and likely had no idea he had a son. "Maybe someday," Logan said quietly. "Right now, I need to figure out who I am, before adding another dad to the mix." My mother's unraveling was the most dramatic of all. The woman who once orchestrated every holiday, every family decision, every manipulation, now seemed physically smaller, her sharpness dulled. When I finally agreed to meet her at a cafe halfway between my apartment and the university, I barely recognized her. "Rachel," she greeted me, voice thin, uncertain. "Thank you for coming." I sat across from her, arms crossed, heart guarded. "I'm still processing, Mom, especially what you did to my lab." She winced. "I was desperate. I knew the DNA tests would unravel everything. I thought if I destroyed your work, you'd give in, that you'd sign over the inheritance to avoid tearing the family apart." She stared into her tea, untouched and growing cold. "It was unforgivable. I know that now." "Yes, it was," I said flatly. "Those samples came from families looking for answers. From sick children, Mom. People who trusted me." Her voice dropped to a whisper. When Calvin mentioned the DNA clause, I panicked. The secret had lived in me for so long, it started to feel bigger than the truth. "Why didn't you just tell the truth years ago?" I asked, trying to steady my voice. "Dad would have been hurt, yes, but at least it would have been honest." Janice stared into her tea, her hands trembling slightly. "Your father was building his academic career when I got pregnant with Logan. A scandal would have crushed his tenure review. I thought it would pass. But time moved on, and the lie became our reality. She finally looked up, eyes filled with tears. I convinced myself I was protecting everyone. You were protecting yourself, I said gently. And now, the truth has cut deeper than it ever would have 35 years ago. The university didn't hesitate. Their legal team moved forward with charges against my mother for the destruction of scientific property and research materials. I didn't advocate for harsh penalties, but I didn't intervene either. Actions have consequences, a truth both moral and scientific. Meanwhile, decisions loomed about Henry's estate. His old craftsman home, where he had lived and worked for 6 decades, stood quiet and waiting, its rooms still echoing with his voice, his research, his legacy. The investment accounts needed oversight. His meticulously kept scientific archive needed preservation. With Calvin's help, I established the Henry Whitman Research Trust, a nonprofit dedicated to funding advancements in rare genetic disorders, especially Whitman-Keller syndrome. Despite everything that had happened, I couldn't ignore Logan's precarious situation. The debt collectors weren't going away. And whatever his biology said, he was still my brother. I'd like to set up structured support for Logan, I told Calvin during one meeting. Nothing direct, just enough to get him clear of the threats, into therapy, and toward a better path. Your grandfather would have approved, Calvin nodded. Even if he suspected the truth, he always cared for Logan. Blood wasn't everything to him. He included Logan in the will, knowing what might come. Henry believed that family is built as much through love and loyalty as it is through chromosomes, Calvin said. Seems like you do too. The university ultimately negotiated a settlement. My mother agreed to pay restitution for the equipment damage, serve probation, continue therapy, and stay away from campus permanently. In the aftermath, the scientific community rallied. Offers for shared lab space, collaborations, and even sample replacements arrived from colleagues and donor families, many outraged by what had happened. And Gerald, my father, filed for divorce, quietly, with the same dignity he had carried throughout his life. Gerald took a sabbatical from teaching. Over dinner one evening at a quiet cafe near the university district, he told me he was finally writing the novel he'd postponed for decades. A story about appearance versus truth, he said, swirling his tea thoughtfully. Although no editor would believe the plot if I included our family's twist. Logan, meanwhile, checked into an intensive therapy program for his gambling addiction. He also enrolled in accounting classes at Hennepin Community College, and somewhat ironically, discovered a genuine talent for numbers, as long as they weren't on a betting slip. Our relationship remained complicated, but it held, no longer defined by biology, but by shared experience and a quiet commitment to showing up for each other. As for my research, the destruction had been a brutal reset. Yet out of necessity, I approached the work with sharper focus and evolved methods. Some data was gone forever, yes, but the rebuilding process sparked improvements I may never have uncovered on my own. 6 months later, our new streamlined protocol was producing better results with fewer resources. It felt like scientific alchemy, transforming loss into insight. My grandfather's house had become both my home and a modest private research facility. I transformed his airy garage into a lab. His study, now mine, bore his framed photo and quiet presence. I often caught myself looking at it, wondering if he had foreseen how his insistence on the DNA clause would rupture and realign our family. In breaking the myth, he had made room for something more honest to emerge. 1 year after the destruction, I stood in my new lab, sunlight filtering through the tall garage windows as Angela, now my full-time research assistant, carefully monitored the new centrifuge. "Dr. Whitman," she called, "samples from Johns Hopkins just arrived. And Dr. Patel wants to confirm if you're still on for the virtual conference next Tuesday. Tell him yes, and have those samples logged and refrigerated," I said, smiling as I took in the space around me. From the wreckage of my old lab, something stronger had risen. Our reimagined approach to studying Whitman-Keller syndrome had led to a major breakthrough. An early intervention protocol showing stabilizing effects in 3 children. A year ago, this would have seemed impossible. Sometimes we need to lose our map to find a better route, my grandfather had written in a journal that somehow survived the firestorm. My phone buzzed. Logan. Just finished certification exam? Pretty sure I aced it. Dinner tomorrow still on? I smiled and texted back. Wouldn't miss it. Logan, my brother, and despite what DNA said, he always would be, had transformed his life in ways I never could have imagined just 18 months earlier. Now, 6 months sober from gambling, he discovered a gift for financial forensics. His sharp attention to detail and knack for pattern recognition, once used to track odds and losses, now served him well in his new role with a local investigative accounting firm. Our relationship, once warped by our mother's favoritism and silence, had grown into something real. No longer tangled in genetics or resentment, we were building a bond rooted in shared experience and mutual respect. You know what's weird? He said during one of our weekly dinners at a small Thai place near the river. I feel more like your brother now than I did before the test, when we were supposedly real siblings. Meanwhile, Gerald, my father, had entered his own era of renewal. After finalizing his divorce, he embraced retirement with a new sense of purpose, finally writing the novel he had talked about for decades. Our weekly phone calls revealed a lighter, more reflective man. I should have stood up for you more, he said one evening. When your mother destroyed your lab, when she pushed the inheritance, I failed you as a father. You're standing up now, I told him gently. That's what matters. The most delicate shift came in my relationship with Janice. After fulfilling her community service and completing her court-mandated therapy, she moved to Tucson, looking for what she called a fresh start. Our contact remained minimal, occasional emails, polite holiday calls. During one, she said, "My therapist thinks I developed narcissistic traits to protect the secret about Logan. I created a lie and defended it like it was truth. Understanding why," I replied, "doesn't excuse what you did, but I'm glad you're trying. I just want you to know I'm working on it." The inheritance that had once threatened to destroy us had found a higher purpose. The Whitman Foundation for Genetic Research, built from the bulk of Henry's estate, now funded rare disorder studies at 3 universities. His old Craftsman home, fully renovated, housed quarterly seminars for emerging geneticists and displayed his preserved scientific archives in a dedicated wing. "Your grandfather would be proud," Calvin said during the Foundation's 1-year anniversary. "Not just of the work, but of you." "I hope so," I said, standing in the study beside his framed photograph. "He understood families are complicated," Calvin added. "That's why he wrote his will not to punish, but to make space for truth." Truth had indeed prevailed, even if it came at a price. From that wreckage, something honest and enduring had begun. Logan and I spoke often, supporting each other as we continued navigating the aftershocks of our family's unraveling. My relationship with Gerald had shifted into something rooted in mutual respect. Not biology, but choice. Even Janice, from her quiet life in Tucson, seemed to be slowly confronting the truth of who she was and the weight of her past decisions. As for me, I'd come to understand that resilience isn't the absence of destruction. It's what you create in its wake. My research had taken new form. My definition of family had evolved, shaped now by authenticity rather than ancestry. That night, working late in what used to be Henry's study, I glanced at his photo. "The irony isn't lost on me, Grandpa," I murmured. A geneticist learning that DNA is the least important part of family. Because while the double helix might map our biology, it can't capture the complexity of love, betrayal, and forgiveness. If you followed my story this far, thank you. It hasn't been easy to share. Every moment of betrayal, loss, and discovery felt like walking through fire. But I've come to learn that healing begins when we stop hiding from the truth and start owning our stories, messy, complicated, and all. I'd love to hear from you. What would you have done in my shoes? Would you have forgiven? Fought harder? Let go sooner? Drop a comment below. I truly want to know. And if something in my journey resonated with you, please consider subscribing. Not just for the next part of my story, but because maybe, like me, you've had to redefine what family means. Maybe you've had to rebuild from the ashes of someone else's decisions. If so, let this space be one where we support each other. Here's what I've learned. DNA doesn't define family. Loyalty, honesty, and love do. And resilience doesn't come from pretending we're strong. It comes from showing up when everything feels broken. So if you're rebuilding, after betrayal, after loss, after hard truths, take heart. You're not alone. You're stronger than you know. And sometimes, the life we build after everything falls apart is the most honest one of all.